Well, last week I finished up my series on Christmas gifts, and next week I have a missionary here at the local church. And so I was left with this interesting week of, do I preach a standalone sermon? Do I start a series? I really wasn't sure what direction I was going in. But that message from last week, the idea of the gift of choice, it really has resonated with my heart. The idea that in 2025, I think it's going to be a theme. What choices am I making? Am I making kingdom choices or selfish choices? Am I serving God, choosing life and not choosing death? Or am I choosing to serve men? You know, all those questions. I think the idea of choice, it has stuck with me. In my devotion, I was reading a story about a man who had a choice in the Old Testament. I want to come to that story today. It's in Nehemiah chapter 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, in this month of Kislev in the 20th year. While I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. And they said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province and are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. And when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And you know, we see Nehemiah in the beginning of this chapter. He's gripped with a burden in his heart. He has a burden for who? The people of God in Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah, we find out he's a cupbearer to the king of Persia, and that's where he's at with this king. And his brothers come and make the report about the state of the Jewish people. Now, what's going on contextually at this time is that Nehemiah is witnessing, or he sees the effects of the exile of Jerusalem or Judah on the people of Judah still today. That was an exile, according to my study Bible, it took place in maybe 3 stages. The first was in 605 BC, where there was nobility and Daniel that were taken into captivity. And then stage 2 in 597, there were 11,000 more Jews, including Ezekiel, that were taken into exile. And then finally, in the last stage in 586, all of Judah, the rest of Judah, was taken into captivity. So Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and exiled God's people. And almost 50 years later, the Persian Empire overtook the Babylonian Empire. And that's when the book of Ezra, which kind of is connected with the book of Nehemiah, occurs. King Cyrus, remember, he allowed some of the exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. They go and build the altar. They start on the temple, but they get distracted. It's not for 20 years that they come back and rebuild the temple, and it was completed in 516 BC. Now, we fast forward another 70 years almost to where Nehemiah begins. The temple's been complete, right? The restoration of God should have taken place, but Nehemiah gets a message, and the message is that the people of God are not living the way God wants them to be right now. What? The walls are still destroyed, and they're threatened by different kings. They didn't finish the job. They rebuilt the temple, but they didn't protect the work. And when he was presented with the reality of the people of Jerusalem who were fearful and broken, he had a tremendous burden. It's fair to say that because he sat down, he wept, he mourned, fasted, and prayed. The question for you today is what stirs you? What's your burden? What's that thing, that situation that when you hear about it, something inside of you jump? The thing that breaks your heart every time you see it or hear it. Because you know, burden inspires mission. Look at Nehemiah's choice. He heard the state of the walls. Step 1 in his choice was that he prayed. Before mission came prayer. Before action came submission. Before planning came petition. Nehemiah's burden led him to the presence of God to see God's direction and will. Remember my question? What's your burden? You know, what stirs you? Once you identify the burden, before action, before planning, we must fast and pray to see what God would have us do. That's the choice we get to make. Do we just do it our way, or do we trust God's way? Nehemiah could have just gone and started to build walls, or he could have said all these things, but he trusted God enough that he prayed. How do I know he prayed? Because then in his position of authority, we see a prayer that comes in Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah 2 continues. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and the gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so I can rebuild it. Again, can you imagine this conversation? He's before the king. He's bringing the king wine, and the king looks at him and he says, you're sad. You're not usually sad when you're not ill. What's going on? And Nehemiah responds, well, I'm sad because how can I be any other way when the place of my ancestors is in ruin? And the king says, what do you want? And I love it. Because not only before action comes prayer, before response comes prayer. I don't know what this looked like. The king says, what do you want? I don't know if Nehemiah stepped away, if he said a prayer under his breath, how it happened, but Nehemiah prayed before he responded to the king's request. What is it you want? God reveals the plan in the pieces. Nehemiah goes, he sends Nehemiah out, but guess what happens when we get busy about the mission of God, doing what God has born in us through the burden, and what stirs us, a lot of times there's resistance that comes. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Verse 19 says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? Later in chapter 4, because the work continues or begins on rebuilding the wall, they're not discouraged, they're not defeated. We see chapter 4, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifice? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah, the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own head. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insult in the face of believers. Nehemiah prayed. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs of Jerusalem walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. You see, when we're busy about the plans of God, when we had a burden, it birthed a mission that was birthed through prayer in us, the enemy will try to hinder the efforts that we're doing for the kingdom of God. And what was Nehemiah's response? He didn't fight back initially, but what did he do? We saw he prayed, and then in verse 9 it says, but we prayed. Everyone prayed. I love this principle of leadership in Nehemiah. He was passionate about a mission that God birthed in him. His passions come through in his people. And when they're faced with a trial, when they're faced with an obstacle, they begin to do what their leader has done, and they prayed. When you walk in step with the Lord, there's a good chance there's going to be some opposition. to the work. The same thing had happened to Ezra when he was rebuilding the temple. Opposition came, distraction came, but Nehemiah completed the task in 52 days. Nehemiah's burden brought a new season, guided by the burden of his heart. But before being accomplished, it had to be bathed in prayer. Choices. We have choices. We must trust in God to accomplish His will. As I was praying this week, I had a moment with the Lord where I said, I love the Lord, but the question in my heart was, am I devoted to the Lord? I love God, and I have a burden to see God's plans accomplished in my life. But the question I had is, am I devoted to seeing that happen? Am I willing to fast and pray? Am I willing to seek God's purpose and face for His will for our community, for His will for our church, for His will for our family? This is modeled in the psalmist. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you. In a dry and parched land where there's no water, I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied with the richest of foods. With the singing of lips, my mouth will praise you. On my bed I will remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. What's your burden? What's stirring you this year? When you recognize that burden, be devoted to God and allow Him to speak to you in the quiet moments and in the loud moments. Allow Him to speak to you when you're seeking Him, when you're serving Him, when you're going before men, and when you're standing before enemies. Trust God with prayer. Pray without ceasing. The Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you, be gracious to you, may He turn His face towards you, grant you His peace. And may you find a burden and take the first step of praying for God's means or solution to that burden. Be blessed.